but we're seeing a direct effort by the STF to overtake that, which they've been quite successful. If you go look at the structures of the trustees on school boards and generally in Saskatchewan, the majority of them are school-attached people, like former teachers, former principals, or former administrators. How do you say we should counter that? Or what advice would you have to encourage more parents to step forward? Because I find sometimes that's a little bit hard. I'm like, let's go, let's affect change, but not everyone's ready to jump. So do you have any advice? Because you've done a lot of work with schools and school reform. Do you have advice on what parents can do now?
Yeah, I would say be like Nike. Just do it. Just get involved. Parents are, if they feel intimidated, they think they don't know the issues. They do. Innately, they do.
They're growing tired of the reckless decision of the unvaccinated. We have been very patient, possibly too patient.
The video has more than 21,000 views, and she had spoken with Mo on Friday.
But some right-wing wacko on YouTube, he'll drop everything and have an hour-long conversation.
These are our family, these are our friends, these are people in our community, Mr. Speaker. We should not be labeling them with right-wing wacko terms like the Leader of the Opposition.
So much damage, so much hurt from both sides. Maybe this is where it starts to change. It should give you hope that people like me can start waking up, and not just waking up, start affecting change. Well, welcome to my first episode where I have a live, real person interview that you're going to learn about shortly. So the episode that we're going to be talking about is the education system in Saskatchewan and what could potentially be due to change it. And my esteemed guest here is Stockwell Day. You probably know him from being involved in the federal government, in provincial government, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm going to let him introduce himself to you a little bit more as to what he's accomplished, perhaps talk about what he's working on now, and give us some advice on how to bring potentially reform to the education system, or even just change the system so it's an education system that matches a lot more families in Canada. But I'm going to let you introduce your accomplishment and anything that you think would be related to the education system or just your political career.
Well, that would take a while, so I don't want to bore your audience with that, but thank you for the opportunity and congratulations for being focused on education. It is the issue of the day. It really is. And it's what got me into politics. Working many years ago, before I was in politics, actually my wife and I were in business at the time, and we had young kids, and we're looking at where and how our kids were going to be educated. And what was available at the time was quite restricted. There wasn't a lot of choice, weren't many alternatives. And so back in the day, this was the last couple of years of Peter Lougheed's premiership in Alberta. We worked with him, along with some other people, and with his Minister of Education, and really introduced what still exists today in Alberta, which is a real choice-based system. It's not perfect by any means, but it allows for some true alternatives in education, and that's what it's still a desperate need today.
Can you explain a little bit the choice-based education? In Saskatchewan, there's been a little bit of development, so a little bit more funding into different types of schools that parents can choose. But I don't believe it to be very similar to Alberta. Alberta, most of the money follows the child, if I'm not mistaken. But can you explain it a little bit more, or are you even familiar on how it is now?
Fairly familiar, just because my kids and grandkids, of course, are involved with the education system in Alberta. Back at that particular time, believe it or not, people who wanted to set up independent education systems, whether it be an independent school or a church-based school, some of them were actually, believe this or not, facing potential jail because they wanted something else than the public education system. And it was on that basis that we really got the attention of the Alberta government and said, look, we think there's a better way to do this. And so at that time, we developed 4 categories of school, which still exist today. So you could have a fully funded independent school. There would be a lot of government intervention if you want to take that full funding. There'd be partially funded. Then there'd be schools for people who wanted independent education, but not necessarily for religious reasons, just because they wanted more choice. And then there were those for the schools that were built right within churches. And that allowed for true choice. And also allowed, it was one of the first in Canada, to allow for some significant funding to flow to the school of your choice. The more funding you got, of course, the more integrated you were with government oversight, etc. And as I was saying, that system, there needs to be choice in education, not just primary and secondary, but we're seeing more and more of the need in post-secondary education. We have a system now that is, most people would agree, largely what we call culturally Marxist in terms of its basic philosophy. And there's a lot of people who want larger choice, even post-secondary. And those are some things that we continue to pursue.
There's two avenues that I would like to talk to you about, because you were at an event today where you spoke about cultural Marxism, but also Smithsonian way of running government. Can you explain to our viewers kind of the difference between that and maybe where we're seeing a little bit of that being introduced, whether it's cultural Marxism being introduced in our education system, what that would look like just for our viewers, and what your ideal system to be introduced in our system would be, which you spoke about at the event, the Smithsonian, I believe it's called. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I use those terms just to help people kind of anchor their thoughts and recognize there's some very philosophically foundational differences in terms of types of education. So when I say cultural Marxism, obviously I'm talking about Karl Marx and his particular system of government that he was proposing. And what we talk about just in the broadest of streams, because there's books been written on this, you can get very granular. But basically, he didn't believe in God. So he did not think there was any accountability among humans for any other higher power. He didn't believe in the positive attributes of the family, where a family can nurture an individual who can then be very value added to the community as a mature and functioning individual and adult. And the third area, of course, is so you've got how a government would actually conduct itself with government power. And his view, a Marxist view, is very much that a very few, call them super elite people, a core of elitists would have extreme power and be able to control really millions of people. And that his thought was that there's a few really smart human beings that could be called upon to exert huge power to bring people to sort of one unified system of belief and therefore have a peaceful world. And that's what we call communism. And then a counter to that, I'll use Adam Smith, but he's one of many. People say he's just an economist, but these people were philosophers. And so even their own philosophical view was derived from their theological view. And Adam Smith believed there was a God, believed there was accountability to God, and believed that in familial relations within a family, that would be the best way in which a person could be, could mature, could have a sense of well-being, could have a sense of responsibility, and therefore be a very, if I can sound materialistic here, be a very value-added person to the larger community. And that, along with that, would be the ability to have the freedom to choice in terms of investing their own money, investing their time, investing their labor. So you've had really what you could say was a communist system or a more freedom-oriented system. And since it was Adam Smith's, he was one of the principal teachers along this, I call my view Smithsonian. And what the Marxists were successful in doing was get away from their terminology, which was their view really was a communistic, a true commune, but one in which all of the participants in the commune were severely under control by a few people. So the Smithsonian view, which recognizes personal liberty, personal choice, as long as you're not crunching on the choice of others, in fact, will lead to a higher quality of life, a more prosperous community, a more prosperous nation, matter of fact, a more prosperous globe. So we've seen over the last 150 years in what I call the laboratory of the world, we've seen countries who practice a Marxist point of view and those who practice a Smithsonian point of view. Neither of the two are perfect because the human beings evolve, but one substantially leads to higher levels of prosperity and a higher quality of living for those countries which practice and allow a Smithsonian approach to freedom and prosperity.
So where would you say you see the Marxism being introduced a little bit in the classroom? Do you have examples of things that you've heard about that we could kind of give as an example to our viewers?
Yeah, great question. Well, emanating, first of all, from universities, and this is at the turn of the last century in the 1900s, the 1920s, the practitioners of what we call a cultural Marxist point of view were very much, again, that they taking on the teachings of their teacher, being Marx himself. Much of the emphasis was certainly not based on the thought that there could be a God in the universe, and certainly that families were strictly patriarchal, were not productive at all in terms of allowing human growth and human endeavors. So anything to do with family certainly had to be significantly diminished. And then not allowing true choice in terms of discussion, whether it was economic systems, community systems. And that began to permeate through the teaching colleges into the universities, and now is, I would say, the overriding and prevailing view, certainly in North America, if not globally, that you would find in your universities and actually in secondary school and even in the primary grades. This approach to individualism is bad, families are negative, religion definitely is bad, and what we need is a few smart people really running the show. And that's very much the prevailing view in our education system today, both secondary and post-secondary. What we need to have is true alternatives. Allow people, if there are people, and there are, who want to be truly culturally Marxist in their point of view and in their worldview, then let that happen. But there should also be the choice for those who want to be more Smithsonian, more freedom-oriented in their approach. That should be allowed to exist also. Problem is, once you have the, as I call it, the high towers of culture, academe, media, the entertainment sector, that are promoting that one view and actually bringing in policies and principles that disallow the other view to be expressed, then you've got a real problem. And that's what we're dealing with in our society today.
So one of the things that we've noticed a lot where Marxism or the attack on the family unit might have been more readily viewable or witnessed is with this new movement of parental rights that's happened across Canada. So in Saskatchewan, we've got the new Parental Bill of Rights, where it recognizes the family or the parents or the guardians as the ultimate authority over the child's education. And one thing we noticed, which I found shocking, because the school system should actually embrace this idea that parents want involvement, want to be informed. But we saw like a huge attack on this bill, not only come from the teachers, but come from the teachers union and obviously from the political opposition, which wasn't surprising. So one of the things we found very difficult, like you said, the schools are overtaken. The media is kind of pushing one narrative that's very much more in line with that cultural Marxism when it comes to that issue in the schools. How do we, as an organization or as a society, do you have any ideas on how we could counter that in a way that makes it so we don't lose territory on this? Because there's also, they've inundated with them with courts, and then I don't know if you've heard more recently on the injunction application to stop the parental bill of rights or the changes in the school, some of the teachers union have actually come in as intervener, not the one in Saskatchewan, but the national one and some in other provinces. Do you have any advice on how we could counter that potentially as an organization that involves more than just different choices of school?
Yeah, it's a great question. So two things have to be done. It has to be, I use the word attack, has to be attacked on because it's a bit of a war going on. What has finally alerted parents to the erosion of their rights when you're talking about a culturally Marxist point of view? And again, going back to its philosophical roots, that the family is inherently bad, that it's patriarchal, and that it does not allow for the true freedom of expression of a child. So what has really caught people's attention is the advancement related to issues on gender dysphoria, transgender issues. So somebody who would call himself Smithsonian or a belief in personal choice, we would say to adults who want to choose that particular path, if they want to alter themselves, that would be their choice. But when it comes to children, parents must have the oversight there. And that's where you've seen a number of provinces and to a degree in the federal opposition party say, no, we are going to respect parental rights. So this propensity we've been seeing in an alarming way of very young kids first facing puberty-blocking drugs, chemicals actually, and then young kids getting surgery in terms of alteration. It's delicate to talk about, but genitalia alteration for girls, so-called top surgery, where you have young girls going through double mastectomies because they've said to a teacher, I kind of think I'm trapped in the wrong body. And what is the natural outflow of a culturally Marxist position is the family's bad anyway, so parents should not be involved in this decision. But it's this extreme movement that has caused parents to wake up. And so what we're saying is, on the one front, it should be addressed within the schools and within the public schools. And there should be more teaching. Just for instance, kids will be, they'll say, I'm questioning my sexuality. And what will happen is they'll be exposed to one point of view on this right away. And we're hearing more and more examples of kids will go through a very quick, very short interview with a parent or maybe the school psychologist. The next thing is they're moving ahead with puberty blockers and maybe even surgery. And they're not being allowed to even entertain other either studies or thoughts on this. There's a tremendous amount, not just of literature, but on the personal side, tremendous amount of material available on people who have transitioned and now desperately want to detransition. At the very least, and I think adults should be exposed to the two also, but children should be exposed to this also. The other thing that's I find it very alarming is parents tell me that they're terrified when their kids say, well, I think maybe I'm in the wrong body. They're terrified to talk to them and say, let's just wait. It's not that abnormal for someone to have these kind of thoughts. Let's wait till you're through the teen years, at least wait till you're 18 years old. And that is not even being allowed or permitted. So it's leading to a lot of angst and a lot of concerns, needs to be addressed. And children and adults need to be exposed to the other side of this. And what a message parents get that is horrible from many times coming from the psychologists themselves saying, if you try and even ask your kids to hold off on this, you actually put them at risk of suicide. It's going to be so disturbing for them. So parents are terrified, and they're not seeing the very clear data, which is worldwide, that in fact, suicidal ideation is higher among those kids who go through this transition than those who are lovingly counseled to wait and, get through the maturing process, even just physiologically. So parents are in a very difficult position. And because of that, First of all, I said within the system, the school system itself, these things should be challenged. And it gives even more impetus for parents to have a choice in how their children are going to be educated. And so you've seen some very responsible movement by some premiers, allowing that choice and making sure parents are involved in the discussion. But they're always running up against the culturally Marxist viewpoint, again, stemming from Marxist teachings, which is that families are bad, and really the best thing you can do is get kids out of families. And that's causing a lot of problems.
So you mentioned like the data that's coming out. The Premier, when she introduced Premier Smith in Alberta, when she introduced the new parental rights, I would say, or the information or the new legislation, which hasn't quite yet been introduced, but she said it was coming. She referenced something, the CAS report, or I think that's the name. I'll reference it in my video as well for people who want to go read it, that debunks a lot of the information that, or the science that was behind it being good for children to transition, and also that there's no real long-lasting side effect, that it's reversible. We know that's not true. So it's really good to see that kind of legislation come through. It hasn't quite gone that far yet in Saskatchewan. We're going to be lobbying for more, something similar to what Premier Smith has introduced. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Marxism. The way it was kind of explained to me, I'm just going to explain a little bit of my background. So I used to be a police officer specifically trained in profiling child sex offenders. So I'm not going to get too controversial into the details here, but one of the things that we noticed in pedophile activism is they wanted to destructure societal norm, all societal norm. And you see that kind of being implemented in Marxism ideology. They want to destroy the patriarchal norm of what family is. Do you see another avenue that we could tackle that's more than just the parental rights to stop this Marxism ideology in our classroom? Because we spoke to at the event, not you and I, but there was a few people that spoke about DEI and how that's also Marxism ideology. Because right now the big topic is parental rights, but we're noticing our children's being excluded, potentially told they're privileged, and told that there's other people that have more rights than them now because of the DEI initiative. Do you think that's something we should be tackling? And if so, do you have any ideas on how to tackle that aspect? Maybe through legislation or maybe in other ways?
Yeah, well, the DEI, diversity and equity, inclusiveness, so-called, has caused and is causing many problems. It actually sounds counterintuitive, but it is almost, in and of itself, it is racist because it's leaping to unfounded conclusions that certain types of people, certain races possibly, don't have the same opportunities as others. And so there's the others, which are the ones they're concerned about. DEI has a way of excluding people who should be being, let's say, promoted or enhanced on the basis of merit, on the basis of how they can achieve. And increasingly in institutions, academic institutions, and in especially large corporate entities, merit and progress based on true learning is being diminished. And you will be promoted based on how you look rather than, as Martin Luther King used to say, the content of your character. So that's created problems, so much so. Again, if there's a positive in the fact that governments are enforcing and really pushing this, it's that it eventually causes people to get alarmed and to wake up. And now you're seeing, certainly in the U.S., it's almost every day now, different very large corporations that were, I would say, naively embracing DEI philosophy are pulling back from that. Even some universities are. And they're recognizing that certainly in North America, Canada, the United States, there is great opportunity for everybody. All of us, regardless of our particular race, face various challenges. Racism was and still continues to be in some countries a horrendous evil that needs to be addressed. But to hinder the growth of whole groups of people based on falsely premised DEI policy is starting to get a severe reaction. And you're seeing some companies, some universities pull back from this. In Canada, I would say DEI, they're still being pretty strongly enforced to the detriment of those who would like to achieve based on the fact that they're achieving or truly learning something. So DEI is definitely has created its own set of problems. Some of those are being mitigated, but in many cases it's not. It's still marching full strong.
So another thing that we've really noticed in the recent little bit, we have an election coming in Saskatchewan. There's a lot of people with a lot of interest to running for school boards. We've noticed the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation take an active role in almost influencing or taking over some of the trustees' position that are going up for election. So for example, the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation has a website called Tell Them Tuesday. I believe that's the correct one. If it's not, I'll correct it on the screen. And it was used during the labor action, the strikes that were happening. But now they've kind of revamped it and almost to use that to one, not only squash educational choice, they've gone to attack. There's a new program in Saskatchewan, a literacy program, a pilot program that just started with Prairie Spirit School Division, and they're teaming up with an independent school that's experts in the literacy programs. And they got extra funding. So the Teachers Federation was attacking that with Tell Them Tuesday to try to pull funding away from more choices. And then not only that, in the same aspect, they said, get the people who are on our side involved on school board. I feel like almost Teachers Federation has a really loud voice. You also have the opposite parties, but more and more, we're finding parents are losing their voice in the education system, and it's being under attack. So our only avenue for a voice are one-on-one with a teacher, which is, I firmly believe that should be your first way of communication if you're having issues with your child's education, and do it as positively as you can while still being firm as a parent, knowing your authority. But one of the things we've noticed in the school boards, a lot of parents have been silenced. They haven't been given opportunity to speak. So we've done an active effort at getting parents now involved in school board elections. So we've kind of encouraged people to run. We're hopefully going to help provide them support, not financial support, but maybe training on how to campaign or maybe connect them with volunteers. But we're seeing a direct effort by the STF to overtake that, which they've been quite successful. If you go look at the structures of the trustees on school boards and generally in Saskatchewan, the majority of them are school-attached people, like former teachers, former principals, or former administrators. In one school board, in Horizon School Board, I went through the list and only one trustee wasn't school-attached or didn't have a direct relative that was on an employee of the school. How do you say we should counter that? Or what advice would you have to encourage more parents to step forward? Because I find sometimes that's a little bit hard. I'm like, let's go, let's affect change, but not everyone's ready to jump. So do you have any advice? Because you've done a lot of work with schools and school reform. Do you have advice on what parents can do now?
Yeah, I would say be like Nike, just do it. Just get involved. Parents if they feel intimidated, they think they don't know the issues. They do. Innately, they do. And on the issue, going back to the transgender issues, people are terrified of speaking to that just in terms of saying, look, if my kids are talking to teachers about this, we want to know. My kids, and it's happening in Canada, my kids are being signed up for surgery, for instance, or puberty blockers. I want to know that. And but their parents are afraid of raising it because then they'll be called phobic. They'll be saying you're not loving, you're not kind, and there's nothing to do with it at all. I mean, you have to sign forms to get your kids to go on a soccer trip. You can't get an aspirin in most schools unless you have the parents sign.
Exactly.
Child has a headache, we're going to give them an aspirin. But here you can alter them physically, alter their genitals. For girls, the top surgery and the puberty blockers. And it shouldn't be. And so I'm saying to parents, even if you're to put your names forward, if you feel that call to be part of a school board, a school trustee, and definitely go to school board meetings, and don't be afraid to ask the question to the candidates in a school board election. Where do you stand on the transgender issue? Do you believe in parental involvement? Will you advocate for parental responsibility and involvement? Don't be shy about asking. These are your kids. These kids have been entrusted to you. So don't be afraid to raise that. You have to get involved. Silence is compliance. That's all there is to it. And you can't just keep hiding behind the fact. You've got to speak up. So being involved in your present public system, but also working with members of your legislatures to allow for a proper, I'll use the word alternate, but sometimes you say alternate, it has a bit of a negative tone for it, but to advocate for real choice in education. I know in Alberta, we worked and continue to work with the ATA, the Teachers Association, and I think that should be worked with in terms of trying to get them to see it. I'm not that optimistic because they are so completely steeped in cultural Marxism, again, which is against parents. I don't know that that'll change, but there should be an alert that goes out to all parents on it, and then making sure that the present choice in educational models and schools is supported and enhanced. That's the only way you're going to have, you have to have that choice. And again, not to be shy about saying to your teacher, I'll tell you what, it's interesting, Nadine, many people talk to me, and I like your advice about go talk to your teacher first. Many times, the teacher will say, I don't like this. I don't like this transgender stuff. And they'll say to the parent, and they're being sincere, trust me, I am not going to push this stuff in my class. I'm not going to push this on your daughter, on your son. That's okay, and I appreciate the teachers who would say that, but they will be overruled, and that will be overridden by the mandates that are in place to make sure that this is taught to very young children, that there's a high likelihood you're trapped in the wrong body. This is completely unscientific. And yet we're seeing the rates of kids now who say that they are, by something or trapped in the wrong body, or they want to go in the other direction. Because the more it gets taught and the more it gets socialized, the higher the rate grows. And it needs to be addressed at the public school level, but also in terms of offering alternative education, or even within that system. It's difficult to have, some people say, well, you can call your kid out of the class when they're talking about this. That's tough on the kid. So as I understand, in Alberta, they're having an opt-in provision, which is, as a parent, if you want your child specifically taught the transgender, I was going to say theology, it is a theology in ways, but philosophy, you need to sign up for that. Don't put the burden on the parent who doesn't want their child in it, but also doesn't want to be accused of being phobic. Make it, at the very least, bring in an opt-in provision.
Yes, I really agree that that's like a really good aspect. We've had that in Saskatchewan with the sexual education. I love that Daniel Smith explicitly said what is included and what is not, because there's some confusion in Saskatchewan that the LGBTQ agenda can still be taught and that parents don't have to consent to it. However, it's part of the sexual health curriculum. Therefore, just letting my viewers know, because a lot of parents don't know that that's also included in the parental rights legislation that was passed in Saskatchewan. It's not as detailed as the one Premier Smith is planning on proposing, but it's still very good in itself. Now, there's another thing that you talked about today that I want to touch at a little bit. The Alberta Teachers Association is also, or it used to be, the governing body or the licensing body for the teachers. In Saskatchewan, the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation is still that. how should we approach lobbying the provincial government with potentially changing that so we can separate the two, so that the body that gives the license to the teacher is not the same as the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation? And not just that, the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation is also the one who disciplined the teacher. So they represent the teacher and they're supposed to discipline them. And we're noticing, even with the new parental rights legislation, they're saying they're not going to do that. And then so it went back to the provincial government, who then said it's going to be on the school board to take action when a teacher's not following the legislation. I'm wondering, it's one of the big reasons that we started working. Well, okay, if the only way to stop this from continuing is to get on school boards, that's what we're going to do. So our organization, that's actually what led us to promoting parents to get involved. What would it look like as legislation to see that separated? Have you done work in the past on this particular aspect? And if so, what did it look like, in which province would be a good comparison?
Just because the issue itself, I'm talking about the transgender issue, has only recently come to the fore. It hasn't been to sell the need to do that, to have separate certification. Hasn't been that prominent. It's now emerging. So there are a number of professions and occupations which have a body separate than the members themselves, who do the accreditation, who do the discipline. I can remember way back when I was in the legislature in Alberta, and one day asking the Minister of Education at the time, now I can't remember the exact numbers because we're talking 30 years ago. So let's say there was 90,000 teachers. Well, I'm using that as a rough figure. I said, how many teachers this year were let go for poor performance? It's 90,000. In any job, there's going to be the poor performers. Not one. I said, no, one teacher has been let go for poor performance. That's unheard of for any professional body to have that level of excellence. Doctors face it, lawyers face it, most professions and occupations face it, and for people who aren't in an actual certified occupation out on the workforce, you're always subject to possible removal if you're not performing. So that has to be the ability of a teacher to be brought forward for discipline or analysis in terms of lack of performance. That has to come out of the hands of the professional association themselves. They can defend a teacher, but the decision-making has to be removed from that. Otherwise, you're never going to get an onward push towards excellence. I say all this saying we have excellent teachers in the system, many excellent, but many are also motivated for what we would call for ulterior purposes in terms of forcing certain agendas. They shouldn't be able to do that, and they should be subject to analysis and subject to testing of sorts, subject to meet certain performance. Then when you add to that, in the whole philosophy of education, there's been this continual movement away from any kind of testing. So, in fact, how do you even test a teacher to see what they know, to see if they're, like so many other professions, you have to maintain a certain standard, you have to be up on what's happening in the latest developments, and teachers are not subject to that either. So I don't know that you can, if, for instance, a teachers association is really going to grasp those things, try to put them in place at the same time, have an alternate certification system where people who don't want to be exposed to that constant philosophy that they feel is not germane to anything they want to do in terms of how they see life, let there be another certification system. And so people would see, all right, this teacher was certified by let's say the Alberta Teachers Association or the Saskatchewan Federation, and this one was certified by the other professional association, call it Teachers for Autonomy or something. And then employers can decide, yeah, I want the teacher or I want the graduate of that system to be from the one that doesn't really promote innovative thinking, doesn't promote entrepreneurialism, doesn't promote the benefits of family. Yeah, I want someone from the culturally Marxist system. They should be able to have that. But employers should also be able to draw from the other system that promotes things like truly independent thinking, and the value of innovation and entrepreneurial system and freedom of choice in these areas. That needs to be in place, and it really isn't now. Employers need to start demanding that.
Yes, I think that's a really good point and good idea. I know there's talks about that being created in Alberta to give other options. I know many teachers myself. In fact, our organization has about 450 teachers a part of our organization. And
That's
like you
great.
said, there's a lot of really wonderful teachers out there. Personally, all of my kids' teachers, my kids go to public education. I have not had one yet where I had like severe problems with them or anything that I couldn't address over an easy conversation. But obviously, as an organization, we hear a lot because we're the only ones kind of talking about it. We hear a lot about the worst case scenarios. For example, I've reported and talked about a small rural school near Saskatoon where 13 kids out of, it was 43%. So I think 13 out of 30, if I was to do the math. I just can't remember the size of the class it was, but 13 kids identified as LGBTQ, and it was 43%. That's not reflected in current today's society. And when I got this information brought to me by a student and his father, because the student was actually being bullied for being straight in that classroom. And I said, what happened? Like, how did it come to this? So they were now in grade 8, but during grade 6 year, they had a teacher that I would call an activist teacher. We hear about them. We've seen scenarios where you're seeing that being pushed, whether it's Libs of TikTok or some of the other organizations that are bringing it forward. And what happened is that teacher would talk about it every single day in grade 6.
Right.
And she was an activist in the organization. And when someone would come forward, she would celebrate them and treat them better than the other kids. So it almost created this societal structure or societal pressure. There's another word for it. Do you know which word I'm talking about, where it becomes like the new thing? Like we had goth when we grew up, like we had different types of things that created pressure. I just can't think of the word. How much would you say this is happening, or the increased numbers is happening, is based on what's happening in our schools? And how much would you attribute to it potentially happening culturally, whether it's social media, TikTok? Do you have any opinions
Sure.
about that matter?
Well, all of the above. I mean, the entertainment industry, we know very clearly that over the last few years, Disney has moved aggressively in this direction. Previously, when you would see what I'd call traditional roles in a Disney production, Disney celebrates the fact that they really promote transgenderism and, putting that forward in an entertaining way to kids has a real impact. When you see this continually being pushed and pressured, that is going to have an effect on the child. And especially then, if parents are excluded and don't have to be told that this teacher is wooing a child in that direction, then the child hears no counter arguments. The child hears no other alternative and just begins to accept, well, maybe, okay, I was born a boy, but maybe I am a girl. And so you see that high degree of socialization taking in, which again, there has to be a spotlight shone on that. If it's in the public system, parents need to be made aware. And then for those who don't want that, there needs to be an alternative system.
Yeah. So we're going to close in this interview. I'll let you share your final thoughts. So your biggest point is to have alternate schools, so parents can have different choices than potentially just the public education. So is that what you say is the best, most productive way forward? Maybe something as an organization we should be lobbying for more funding for alternative schools, and what that could look like. And if so, as a former elected official, what's the most effective way that you've been lobbied for change that made you want to act?
Well, that's a great question, because when an elected person is convinced that there are numbers of people in their constituency who are motivated on that issue, then they'll pay attention. I'll tell you how it happens, and your viewers can know this. Around a cabinet table, either provincial or federal, an issue will come up, and the premier or the prime minister will say around the table, toss the question out, is anybody hearing about this? And if the response is muted, if the MLA or the member of parliament is saying, quite honestly, I'm not hearing much about this. There's just some crazy activists out there, some extreme
right-wing extremists?
Yeah, exactly. It's left-wing extremists. So in fact, the left wing is far more extreme because they're always trying to take away your rights. Somebody who's on the right of the political spectrum just wants to say, I want my rights. We advocate for freedom to choose these different things. But the left says, no, there'll be no freedom to choose. It's our way or the highway. So getting back to the importance of individuals informing their members of the legislature or the member of parliament that they like something or they don't like something. And oftentimes I would have heard, around a table, when I know it's a concern of parents, but they're not calling their elected representative, then it's muted around the table, and then the leader would say, well, I guess it's not an issue, so let it go ahead. I'll tell you where we're really hearing it over the last few years, and I predicted this would happen, is in what we would call the ethnic communities. I've attended at rallies put on, let's say, by the Sikh community or by the Muslim community. They're not being informed. They're being allowed more leeway in this area, but they're not being informed of what the liberal policy is on their children possibly being transgendered, either chemically or surgically. They're not being informed of that. And when they hear about it, they're horrified. There's a regular occurrence in British Columbia and some of the cities where the Sikh community is out there at busy intersections peacefully demonstrating. And they're holding up signs saying, don't delete our children. Don't delete our children. And I'm advising conservative candidates, go into the mosque, or mosque is willing to have you there. Go into the Sikh temple, but make sure there's a Liberal or an NDP member with you. And then in front of and they're very good. I've spoken to many mosques, many Sikh temples. They're very respectful. They want to ask questions. And then I just say to the Liberal, just explain your transgender policy to these people. Explain to them. I'll tell you what, that's a very somber moment. And many times you will see the Liberal candidate completely back away from it. Say, oh, it's not that big a deal. It's not happening really. But when someone from, a person from these various ethnic communities hear that their child may be counseled into puberty-blocking chemicals or, in fact, surgery without the parent being aware of that counseling, they're horrified. And they will rebel against that. And that's the importance of parental involvement, whatever your ethnic background.
It's funny, they want to talk about inclusivity constantly when trying to push these types of teaching. But when you really look into it, there's certain groups of people, parents, especially people with strong faith, that it completely excludes. So that's one of the things we've been talking about. Well, if you're truly going to be inclusive, you have to also include parents that have different values and children that grow up in households that have different values. But thank you so much for doing this interview with me. And I hope we're going to have you on our show again, because you had so much really good information. And I could talk to you for several more hours, but I'm pretty sure you want to get on the road. But if you're watching this and you want to hear more interviews like this, we'll be interviewing other people in government, people in leadership position, and talk about the issues we're not supposed to talk about. So if you want to hear more about that, you can like and subscribe this wherever you're following it, or follow me on any social media with the handle Nadine Gines. Thanks. Have a good day.